We're all somewhat familiar with the idea of mental toughness. I mean, most of us wish we had more of this, or this is a character trait that we desire as athletes. But as endurance athletes, what does this even look like? What does it mean to be a mentally tough competitor? Is it as simple as just gritting your teeth and pushing past your body's limit? That's what we're going to look at in today's video. How would you feel if I told you you had to race somebody who was more physically fit than you were? You might feel up for the challenge, you might be a bit afraid, you might even throw your arms up in rage saying, well then what's the point? But what if I also told you that there was a way to beat this person without being stronger than them physically? Every race is won one of two ways. The first and most logical way to win races is to be the strongest, most physically fit person in the race. This seems to make sense, and this is probably the most simple way to win races. I mean, that's the whole goal of training, isn't it? To be the strongest rider that we can be. But we know that this can't be the only way that bike races are won, or the same guy would win every weekend. At least until somebody became stronger than him, in which that person would take over the winning streak.
Did I win?
The second way to win a bike race is to optimize more of a lesser physical capacity. In my video on the endurance ride, which I'll link in the description below, we were introduced to two imaginary riders, Drew and Dylan. Dylan has an FTP of 400, while Drew only has an FTP of 380. You'd think that Dylan would win hands down, but that's not always the case. If Drew can ride at a higher percentage of his FTP, let's say 370, while Dylan can only ride at 360, now the favor turns to Drew being the best rider. But how do we make this happen? And how do we get closer to those limits? This is where mental training comes into the picture. Matt Fitzgerald has got to be my all-time favorite author when it comes to coaching topics. And he knocks it out of the park with his book, How Bad Do You Want It? Fitzgerald sums up mental fitness as a collection of coping skills, behaviors, thoughts, and emotions that help athletes master the discomfort and stress of the athletic experience, mainly by increasing tolerance for perceived effort and by reducing the amount of effort that is perceived at any given intensity of exercise. Like Yogi Berra once said, 90% of sports are mental and the other half are physical. This is a pretty big topic, the mental side of training. So I'll be tackling it in a series of videos starting off today with an explanation of perception of effort. Perception of effort, or perceived exertion, is the cognitive feeling of voluntary physical work. Basically, it's how you feel when you do any kind of physical activity. You see, our brains and our bodies are like a two-way traffic road. Our brains are constantly sending messages to our body to do certain things, while our body is constantly sending feedback to our brain, letting it know how it's feeling and how it's doing with those tasks. As the intensity of those tasks increases, the messages that the body sends to the brain tells it that these things feel harder. There's two things to consider here. There's the effort itself, and then there's the perception of that effort. And you might think that these two things are the same thing, but they're not. The effort itself is taking place in your muscles, but the perception of that effort is taking place in your brain. Let's bring back our two imaginary riders, Drew and Dylan. Let's pretend now that they have the same FTP and they just completed the same exact power intervals workout. However, Dylan felt awful during the intervals and Drew felt great during the intervals. Drew would have pressed the little smiley face icon on Training Peaks, while Dylan would have pressed the sad face icon on Training Peaks. So what gives? They did the same exact effort, they had the same exact power, the same numbers, the same intervals. Why was Dylan's perceived effort so much higher than Drew's? Well, it turns out Dylan stayed up all night last night watching YouTube videos. Doofus. This goes to show that there are many ways that you can alter your perception of effort without actually altering what's happening in your muscles. I like the way that Alex Hutchinson explains it when he says, anything that moves your effort dial up or down in your brain will determine how far and how fast you can run. Another concept tied into all of this is reaching our limit. You'll hear people all the time say that they bonked, or that they hit the wall, or that they just couldn't push any further. And what they're talking about is their maximal physical capacity. This is to have completely spent one's self. But the truth is, they're liars. No matter how hard we push ourselves, we never reach true physical limits. Let me explain. Our bodies do indeed have hard physical limits, and bad things happen if we go beyond these limits. If we did push our bodies to the ultimate limit, we would encounter tissue damage, organ failure, and eventually death. But our brains are smart enough to not let us push ourselves that deep, and so it sends out messages to our body to chill out before you kill yourself. Fitzgerald writes, the brain produces feelings of discomfort, pain, and loss of motivation in order to make the runner voluntarily slow down or stop, thus reinforcing the involuntary slowing aspect of fatigue. But just how close we get to that limit is where perception of effort comes into play. When we're training and racing, there are two walls that we're constantly trying to push further and further. Let's start with the second wall. This is our maximal physical output. Increasing this includes increasing your physical fitness, or your body's actual limit. This would include things like VO2 max and lactate threshold. And while there are hard physical limits to our physical output, we never actually reach these limits. We will always be stopped by the first wall before we even make it to the second wall. This first wall is our brain's maximum tolerance for perceived exertion. However, the closer that these two walls are to one another, the more we're optimizing our true fitness and the better our performance will be. This is the whole goal of training. When we train and put ourselves through grueling intervals week in and week out, we're obviously trying to push back that second wall and increase our physical fitness. But at the same time, we're also pushing back that first wall and changing our relationship to perceived effort. Basically, the more you put yourself in the hurt locker, the more you can tolerate it. So how can we apply this to our training? Answer: high intensity intervals. This study on perceived effort wanted to figure out which workouts felt harder between a steady effort workout and a high intensity interval workout. Here's what they concluded. Although each session required the same amount of total work, these results point toward the possibility that intervals of similar relative intensity not exceeding 60 seconds may be preferable if the goal of exercise is to produce significant cardiometabolic stress while minimizing exposure to perception of exertion being less effortful. And while this study was conducted using unfit individuals, this makes sense because it's also been proven that high-level athletes have a high tolerance for pain. So using unfit individuals makes the results of the test a little bit clearer. So one of the ways that you can improve your training is by incorporating more low-volume, high-intensity intervals. By doing so, you'll actually spend more time in higher power zones than if you tried to do intervals longer than about 60 seconds. This is why 30-30s is one of the all-time best workouts out there. This is my go-to workout before a big race block. Matt Fitzgerald ends up saying that it's not the effort that we have to endure, but the perception of that effort. He goes on to write, perceived effort is essentially the body's resistance to the mind's will. The fitter an athlete becomes, the less resistance the body puts up. We all want to win races, but we won't win races unless we either gain more fitness and or optimize the fitness we do have. The key to this secret weapon could be mental training. Let me leave you with one line from Fitzgerald's book that has stuck with me for weeks now. In every race, something within each athlete, something we may now specify as perception of effort, poses a simple question. How bad do you want it? To realize your potential as an athlete, you must respond with some version of this answer: more. And then you have to prove it. It's easy in principle, hard in practice. Much harder than figuring out how to train, what to eat, and which shoes to wear. Over the next few weeks, we're going to take a deeper look at ways that we can improve our mental game. Stay tuned for those. All right, that's all I've got for this video. If you liked it, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and share with all of your cycling buddies. And also, if you're looking for a cycling coach, be sure to check out the Ignition Coach Co website in the description below. We'll get you set up with a top-notch, science-based coach. Until next time, y'all stay rad.